It all started in a small suburban neighborhood where life was simple and joys came easily. I was just a boy back then, barely 11, spending my days climbing trees, riding bikes with friends, and losing myself in the adventures of comic books. The world felt infinite, a place full of wonder and possibility. My family, my mom, my stepdad, and my stepsister were my anchors. We weren't perfect, but we were happy in our own way. Those early years were a time of innocence, where the biggest worries were scraped knees or missing a favorite TV show. Looking back now, I see those days as a golden chapter of my life. The laughter shared at the dinner table and the warmth of my grandmother's hugs when we visited her countryside home were moments I would later cling to. Life had its natural rhythms, and I was blissfully unaware of the darker corners of the world. My stepsister, Ashley, was 2 years older than me. She was the epitome of cool in my young eyes, smart, confident, and always a little rebellious. We didn't always get along, as siblings often don't, but she was the one who introduced me to new things. Sometimes it was a new video game, other times it was a band I'd never heard of. Ashley had a knack for breaking rules, which made her fascinating to me, and at times a little dangerous. One summer afternoon, Ashley and I were rummaging through old DVDs in the basement. Amidst the piles of dusty action movies and rom-coms, we stumbled upon a disc without a label. "Let's see what this is," she said, her tone filled with mischief. I didn't know it at the time, but that moment would change the course of my life. When the screen lit up, it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a movie or a TV show. Instead, it was something I didn't fully understand, but felt instantly embarrassed about. Ashley quickly turned it off, laughing nervously, and said, "Don't tell Mom." I nodded, not fully processing what I had seen, but feeling an odd mix of curiosity and shame. That night, as I lay in bed, fragments of the images flashed in my mind. I didn't have the words or the knowledge to articulate what I felt. It was as though a tiny crack had appeared in the innocence that had once shielded me. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, but deep down, I knew something had shifted. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that afternoon didn't fade. Instead, it grew. I found myself wondering about what I had seen. Ashley's nonchalant attitude made it seem like it wasn't a big deal, so why couldn't I stop thinking about it? One evening, when I was home alone, I worked up the courage to search for similar content online. It was surprisingly easy to find. My young mind was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of what was available. At first, it felt like a harmless curiosity, a secret exploration of something mysterious. But even in those early moments, there was an underlying feeling that what I was doing wasn't entirely right. Amidst my burgeoning curiosity, life continued as usual. At school, I developed my first crush on a girl named Emma. She had a laugh that could light up the room and a kindness that made her stand out. I'd sit behind her in class, heart racing every time she glanced my way. Emma represented something pure and exciting, a reminder of the innocence that still lingered within me. One day I mustered the courage to talk to her. We bonded over a shared love for superhero movies, and soon we were partners for a class project. Spending time with Emma felt like stepping into the sunlight after being in the shadows. It was real, genuine, and so different from the fleeting satisfaction of my secret online explorations. Around this time, I began noticing how other boys at school talked about similar topics. During lunch breaks, they'd joke about things they'd seen online, sharing links and laughing as though it was all just a game. Their casual attitudes made me feel like my curiosity was normal, even expected. "You haven't seen this?" one of my friends asked incredulously when I pretended to be clueless. "You're missing out." The peer pressure was subtle but effective. It reinforced the idea that this was just a part of growing up, a harmless rite of passage. Everything changed during a family visit to my grandmother's house. Her home, nestled in the countryside, had always been a sanctuary for me. It was a place of warmth, love, and stories shared over freshly baked cookies. But this time, the visit felt different. While exploring her attic, I found an old laptop. Curiosity got the better of me, and I turned it on. The privacy of the attic felt liberating, and I gave in to my growing habit. For the first time, it wasn't just about curiosity, it was about escape. When I closed the laptop, guilt washed over me. I couldn't meet my grandmother's eyes at dinner that night. After that day, the habit began to take root. It was no longer occasional, it was becoming a routine. I started staying up late, waiting for everyone to go to bed so I could have time alone. The content became a secret world I retreated to, a place where I could explore without judgment. But it came at a cost. I began to withdraw from my family, avoiding conversations and skipping family game nights. Even my bond with Ashley, who had unknowingly set this chain of events in motion, began to weaken. She noticed the change and asked if I was okay, but I always brushed her off. The habit wasn't just affecting my relationships, it was changing me. I became more irritable and impatient. At school, I started zoning out during lessons, my mind preoccupied with thoughts I couldn't shake. Teachers began to notice, calling me out for not paying attention. My confidence took a hit, too. The boy who had once eagerly raised his hand in class now slouched in his seat, hoping not to be noticed. I felt like I was carrying a secret that was too heavy for my young shoulders, a secret that was slowly chipping away at who I used to be. Despite all this, there were moments when I recognized the warning signs. One evening, as I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized the boy looking back at me. My eyes seemed duller, my posture slouched. "What's happening to me?" I whispered to myself. But the thought was fleeting. The allure of my secret world was too strong, and I convinced myself it wasn't a problem. After all, everyone else seemed to be doing it. What made me any different? The slide downwards began so subtly that I didn't even notice it at first. What had once been an occasional curiosity was now becoming a regular part of my life. It started with late nights, sneaking back to the computer after everyone had gone to bed. At first I told myself it was harmless, just something I did to unwind, but gradually it started taking over. My mornings became sluggish, and I found it harder to concentrate in school. Even my favorite activities, like basketball, didn't excite me the way they used to. The pull of my secret habit grew stronger, like a shadow looming over my every decision. School was where the cracks became most visible. My grades started to drop, and teachers began to notice. "You seem distracted," Mrs. Thompson said one day, her tone gentle but probing. I nodded, mumbling something about feeling tired. How could I explain the real reason? How could I tell her that I was staying up all night consumed by something I didn't even fully understand? Group projects became a nightmare. My friends, who once relied on me, started to pull away as I failed to meet deadlines. I felt ashamed, but instead of facing it, I retreated further into my growing addiction. It was a vicious cycle. The more I withdrew, the more I needed the false comfort of my secret world. As time went on, I began to feel an invisible wall building around me. I avoided eye contact with friends and family, terrified that they might somehow see through me. The anxiety was crippling. Every notification on my phone felt like a potential confrontation. Social events, once something I looked forward to, became unbearable. At a birthday party for one of my classmates, I found myself sitting in a corner, scrolling through my phone, disconnected from the laughter and conversations around me. It was easier to escape into a screen than to face the growing emptiness inside. Hiding my habit became an art form. I learned to clear my browser history, use incognito mode, and always have an excuse ready if someone walked in on me unexpectedly. My heart would race every time I heard footsteps outside my door. One evening, my mom knocked as I was hastily closing a tab. "Dinner's ready," she said, her voice muffled through the door. "Coming," I replied, forcing calmness into my tone. My hands trembled as I turned off the screen. The fear of being caught was constant, but it wasn't enough to stop me. By then, I was too deep into the habit to see a way out. When the lockdowns hit, the isolation turned my habit into an all-consuming obsession. With no school, no sports, and no social gatherings, my days blurred together. I'd wake up late, eat whatever was easiest, and spend hours in my room with the door locked. The habit that had once been a nighttime escape became an all-day indulgence. The lack of structure in my life gave it the perfect breeding ground. During those months, things escalated. What had once been a once-a-day habit spiraled into multiple times daily. Each session left me feeling emptier than before, but I couldn't stop. The content I sought out became more extreme, feeding a cycle of shame and dependency. Physically, I felt drained. My skin lost its glow, my eyes were perpetually bloodshot, and my energy levels plummeted. Mentally, I was numb. The highs from my addiction were fleeting, leaving behind an ever-growing void. The physical toll was undeniable. I'd lost weight, not because I was eating healthier, but because I was barely eating at all. I stopped going outside even when the weather was beautiful. My basketball hoop, once my sanctuary, sat unused in the driveway, gathering dust. My parents noticed the changes. "You've been looking pale lately," my mom said one evening, concern etched on her face. "Are you feeling okay?" "Just tired," I lied, avoiding her gaze. How could I tell her the truth? How could I explain something I barely understood myself? My friends, the ones I used to laugh with and confide in, began to drift away. At first, they invited me to hang out, but after a string of declined invitations, the calls stopped coming. I'd scroll through social media, seeing their posts about movie nights and basketball games, feeling like an outsider looking in. The loneliness was suffocating, but instead of reaching out, I retreated further into my addiction. It was my escape, my coping mechanism, even as it destroyed the connections I once held dear. Basketball had always been my passion, my outlet. But when tryouts came around that year, I was unprepared. My energy was gone, my focus shattered. During the drills, I struggled to keep up, missing shots I would have made with ease a year ago. "What's going on with you?" Coach asked, his voice tinged with disappointment. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't tell him that my late-night habits had left me too drained to perform. When the team list was posted, my name wasn't on it. It felt like a punch to the gut. Basketball had been my anchor, and now I had nothing left to hold on to. The rejection from the basketball team marked a turning point. I'd look in the mirror and barely recognize the person staring back at me. My shoulders slumped, my eyes were hollow, and my skin seemed to sag with the weight of my shame. I'd sit in my room for hours replaying every mistake in my mind. How did I let it get this bad? I'd whisper to myself, tears streaming down my face. But even in those moments of despair, I couldn't stop. It wasn't until one particularly dark night that I faced the truth. I'd spent the entire day indulging my habit, barely moving from my chair. As I shut off my screen for the last time that night, a thought struck me like lightning. I'm addicted. The word felt heavy, suffocating. Addiction was something that happened to other people, not me. And yet there it was, staring me in the face. Admitting it was painful, but it was the first step toward understanding the depth of the problem. In my search for answers, I stumbled across videos and articles about self-improvement. One term stood out: NoFap. It was a community of people who had faced similar struggles and were fighting to regain control of their lives. The stories they shared resonated deeply with me. They spoke about the same feelings of shame, the same loss of energy, and the same desire to break free. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Fueled by newfound determination, I decided to quit. I deleted my browser history, installed blockers on my devices, and promised myself I'd never go back. The first few days were brutal, the cravings were constant, and the urge to relapse felt overwhelming. I failed more times than I could count, each failure chipping away at my resolve. But with every attempt, I learned something new about myself and my triggers. The lowest point came on a day when I relapsed 8 times. 8. By the end of the day, I felt utterly defeated. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, tears streaming down my face. Is this who I am now? I wondered, the weight of my actions pressing down on me like a lead blanket. In that moment of despair, something shifted. I realized that if I didn't fight back now, I might never get out of this hole. Rock bottom became my wake-up call, the turning point I so desperately needed. From that day forward, I made a promise to myself. This time, it wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. I knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but I was ready to fight for my life back. With shaky determination, I began to take the first steps toward recovery. The morning after my lowest point felt different. It wasn't the kind of difference you feel when you wake up refreshed after a good night's sleep. No, this was more like waking up to a storm-battered world and realizing you're still standing. For the first time in months, I felt the tiniest spark of determination. I didn't want to live like this anymore. The first thing I did was grab a notebook. I wrote down everything I felt, the shame, the regret, the hopelessness. Then I wrote a single question. What do I want my life to look like? That question would become my guiding star. I turned to the internet again, but this time not for the reasons I used to. I searched for forums, support groups, and personal stories from people who had overcome similar struggles. That's when I discovered a community dedicated to breaking free from addiction. They called it NoFap. Their stories mirrored my own. The isolation, the shame, the cycles of quitting and relapsing. But what struck me most was their resilience. These weren't just stories of struggle, they were stories of victory. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that victory could be mine too. The first days of recovery were some of the hardest. The cravings were relentless, each one screaming at me to give in. My body felt like it was rebelling against me, and my mind wasn't much better. It whispered lies. Just one more time won't hurt. But I clung to my notebook like a lifeline. Whenever a craving hit, I'd write about it. I'd describe the feeling, the temptation, and then remind myself of the life I wanted to build. It didn't always work, but it worked enough to get me through those first crucial days. Recovery brought an unexpected challenge: loneliness. My addiction had been my constant companion, filling every quiet moment. Without it, the silence was deafening. One night I sat alone in my room, staring at the empty walls. Tears welled up as the weight of my solitude pressed down on me. But instead of reaching for my old crutch, I picked up the phone. I called an old friend I hadn't spoken to in months. "Hey, it's been a while," I said, my voice shaky. "Yeah, it has," they replied, their tone cautious but warm. That conversation was the first step in rebuilding the connections I had lost. My family had always been there, but in my darkest moments, I had pushed them away. Now I realized how much I needed them. One evening, I sat down with my mom in the kitchen. "Can we talk?" I asked. She nodded, setting aside her book. "I've been going through something," I began, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to explain it, but I'm trying to get better." Her eyes filled with tears as she reached for my hand. "We're here for you," she said. Those words, simple as they were, felt like a balm on my wounded soul. A few weeks into my recovery journey, we visited my grandmother's house. This was the place where it had all begun, where my addiction had first taken root. Walking through the familiar rooms, I felt a pang of anxiety. The memories were still fresh, the triggers lurking around every corner. But this time I was prepared. I brought my notebook, my phone loaded with motivational podcasts, and a plan to stay occupied. I spent the weekend helping my grandmother with chores, listening to her stories, and rediscovering the simple joys of connection. Breaking free from addiction wasn't just about stopping, it was about replacing. I needed new habits to fill the void. I started with exercise, setting a goal to run every morning. The first few runs were grueling, my legs screaming in protest. But with each step, I felt a little stronger, a little more alive. I also took up journaling, pouring my thoughts onto paper every night before bed. It became a ritual, a way to process my emotions and track my progress. Slowly but surely, these new habits began to reshape my days and my mindset. As I distanced myself from my addiction, I started to notice things I had overlooked for years. The way sunlight streamed through my bedroom window in the morning, the sound of birds chirping outside, the taste of a home-cooked meal. These small joys, once drowned out by my constant need for escape, became my anchors. They reminded me of the beauty in everyday life, the beauty I had been too blind to see. Recovery wasn't a straight line. There were days when the cravings felt insurmountable, when the weight of my past threatened to pull me under. But each time I stumbled, I got back up. I reminded myself of the stories I had read in the NoFap community, of the people who had faced even greater challenges and emerged victorious. Their resilience became my inspiration, their strength my motivation. The first time I went a full week without relapsing, I felt a surge of pride. It was a small victory, but it was mine. I celebrated by treating myself to a new pair of running shoes, a tangible reminder of my progress. Each small win built my confidence, creating a snowball effect. With every milestone, I felt more capable, more in control of my life. Reconnecting with old friends was a slow process. Some had moved on, their lives taking different paths, but others welcomed me back with open arms. One friend in particular became my confidant. I told him about my struggles, my journey, and my determination to change. "I'm proud of you," he said, his words genuine and heartfelt. That support meant more to me than I could express. As I ventured further into recovery, I began to meet new people. At the gym, during a local running club meetup, even at community events I once avoided. Each new connection felt like a step toward a brighter future. These relationships were built on authenticity, not the facade I had hidden behind for so long. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen. One day, as I scrolled through the NoFap forums, I came across a post from someone just starting their journey. Their words echoed my own from months ago, full of fear and uncertainty. I left a comment, sharing my story and offering encouragement. Helping others gave me a sense of purpose, a way to turn my pain into something positive. It became a cornerstone of my recovery, a reminder that my journey had value beyond myself. Forgiving myself was one of the hardest parts of recovery. For so long, I had carried the weight of my mistakes, the shame of my addiction. But as I look back on my journey, I realized that those mistakes had shaped me, taught me, and ultimately led me to this moment. "I forgive you," I whispered to my reflection one morning. The words felt foreign, but they also felt right. By the time I reached the end of Act 3, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. My days were filled with purpose, my relationships were stronger than ever, and my sense of self was restored. I knew the journey wasn't over. Recovery was a lifelong process, a daily commitment. But for the first time in years, I felt equipped to face whatever came my way. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are the ones no one else can see. But trust me when I say this, no matter how deep you think you've fallen, there's always a way out. This is the part of my story where I found that way. where hope began to grow again. It started with a simple decision, one I'd made 1,000 times before, but never truly followed through on. This time, though, it felt different. I was tired of being tired. Tired of feeling like I was living in a shadow of who I could be. I sat down and wrote out my goals. Not just to stop the addiction, but to start living the life I always wanted. And that one small step, it changed everything. You see, recovery isn't just about stopping a bad habit. It's about creating a life so fulfilling that you don't even feel the need to go back. My first challenge was building a routine. For so long, my days revolved around that one destructive habit. I had to replace it with something better, something healthier. I started small, waking up at the same time every day, making my bed, and going for a short walk in the morning. Sounds simple, right? But those little wins, they started to add up. And guess what? You can do this too. Start with just one thing, a morning stretch, a journal entry, or even drinking a glass of water as soon as you wake up. Small habits lead to big changes. But recovery isn't all smooth sailing. I'd be lying if I said I didn't stumble. The hardest moment came when I visited my grandmother's house again. It was the same place where my addiction had taken root. The memories? They hit me like a ton of bricks. But instead of giving in, I reminded myself of why I was doing this, why I had to keep going. I took deep breaths, grounded myself, and left the room where those triggers lived. I made it through that day. And if you're facing your own triggers, remember, you are stronger than any moment of weakness. You've got this. As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years: joy. I reconnected with old friends, friends who had missed me but didn't know how to reach me while I was buried in my struggles. We laughed, shared stories, and for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. And then there was basketball. I picked up that ball again, and you know what? It felt like coming home. The court became my sanctuary, a place where I could channel all my energy and frustration into something positive. Here's the thing about recovery. It's not just about healing yourself. It's about helping others find their way too. That's why I decided to share my story. I created a video, pouring my heart out, hoping that someone, anyone might hear it and realize they're not alone. And maybe that someone is you. If this story resonates with you, if you're struggling, know that there's a way out. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. Pause for a moment. If you've made it this far, hit the like button. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Let's build a community where no one has to feel alone. A year passed. A full year without falling back into the cycle that had once consumed me. I celebrated that milestone quietly, with a few close friends. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about knowing I had reclaimed my life. For the first time in years, I opened my heart to someone. A real, genuine connection. It wasn't easy. Trust doesn't come back overnight. But step by step, we built something meaningful. And that connection, it reminded me of everything I'd been missing all along. Real love, real intimacy, real joy. Today, I'm not just living a better life. I'm working to help others live one too. I've joined communities, spoken at events, and shared resources that can make a difference. Because this isn't just my story. It's the story of millions of people who are struggling in silence. I returned to my grandmother's house again recently. This time, it didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a place of healing, a reminder of how far I've come. If you're in the middle of your own fight right now, remember, one day you'll look back and see how strong you've become. So here we are, the end of the story, but maybe the beginning of yours. If you're struggling, take this as your sign to start. Start small, start scared, just start. And before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Let's reach as many people as we can. Let's create a ripple effect of hope, one story at a time. Thank you for listening, for sharing this moment with me. Together we can make a difference.